The punishment had been meant to humiliate her. That much Clara Doyle understood the moment Foreman Whitcomb pointed his weathered finger toward the low, smoke-stained bunkhouse kitchen and told her, in front of half the ranch hands at the Lazy Diamond spread, that she'd be cooking for the men from now until he decided otherwise. It was meant as a come-down, a public correction for a woman who had spoken too plainly at a ranch meeting about wages owed and promises broken, and everyone standing in that dusty yard that morning had understood it as such, including Clara herself, who had felt her cheeks burn with a shame so hot it had nearly brought her to tears before she managed to swallow it down and simply nod. She was 26 years old, the daughter of a ranch hand who had died of a fall from a green-broke horse 3 winters past, and she had been taken in by the Lazy Diamond's owner, old Silas Marchetti, more out of a grudging sense of obligation than any real generosity. She mended, she cleaned, she did the 1,000 small invisible tasks that kept a working ranch from collapsing into chaos, and she had never once been asked her opinion on anything of consequence until the day Whitcomb announced a cut to the hands' wages that would have left half the men unable to send money home to their families, and Clara, who had grown up listening to her father's stories of unfair labor and broken promises, had stood up in the meeting and said, plainly and without apology, that it was a shameful thing to do to men who had given the ranch their backs and their years. Whitcomb had not appreciated being corrected by a woman, least of all in front of the men he was meant to command, and his punishment had been swift and calculated. Banishment to the bunkhouse kitchen, a dim, grease-stained room where the previous cook, a half-blind old drunk named Pruitt, had spent a decade producing meals so uniformly gray and flavorless that the hands had taken to calling anything unpleasant Pruitt stew. As a standing joke, Clara was to take over his duties entirely, feeding 20 hungry ranch hands 3 times a day on whatever meager stores the ranch's ledger allowed, a task designed, Whitcomb made plain with a satisfied smirk, to keep her too exhausted and too humbled to ever again raise her voice at a ranch meeting. What Whitcomb had not accounted for, in his eagerness to see Clara Doyle brought low, was that her mother, before her own early death, had been a cook of considerable reputation back in the Kentucky hill country they'd come west from, and had taught her daughter everything she knew in the years before illness took her. How to coax flavor from the humblest of ingredients. How to make a tough cut of meat fall tender with patience and the right slow heat. How to bake biscuits so light they seemed to float off the pan. How to stretch a small store of provisions into meals that tasted, against all reasonable expectation, like abundance rather than scarcity. Clara had cooked for her father in the years since, quietly, without occasion to demonstrate the fullness of her skill to anyone beyond their own small table, and she had never imagined that a punishment meant to shame her would become the very thing that revealed what she had been capable of all along. The first morning, she rose before dawn and surveyed the meager supplies the ranch kitchen offered her with a critical eye that would have made her mother proud. Flour gone slightly stale, a side of salt pork, dried beans, a sack of onions sprouting in the corner, a few withered carrots, and little else beyond the basic staples any working ranch kept on hand. She might have produced the same gray, joyless fare Pruitt had served for a decade, and no one would have blamed her for it, given what little she had to work with. Instead, she set to work with the same quiet determination she brought to every task life demanded of her, rendering the salt pork slowly to draw out its fat, using that fat to coax deep flavor from the onions and carrots, soaking the dried beans overnight and seasoning them with herbs she gathered wild from the creek bank, and mixing a batch of biscuit dough with a lightness of hand that came from years of practiced patience. When the ranch hands filed into the bunkhouse for their midday meal that first day, prepared for the same dismal fare they'd endured for years, the silence that fell over the room when they tasted what Clara had prepared was so complete that she nearly mistook it for displeasure, until she looked up and saw 20 weathered, sun-browned faces regarding their plates with something like reverent disbelief. "Miss Doyle," said one of the older hands, a grizzled cattleman named Pete Ruskin who had ridden for the Lazy Diamond longer than anyone could remember. "I don't believe I've eaten this well since my mother's table, and that woman's been gone 20 years. Word of Clara's cooking spread through the ranch and then, as such things do in cattle country, beyond it entirely, carried by hands who moved between spreads during the busy season and could not help boasting of the meal they'd had at the Lazy Diamond bunkhouse. It reached the ears of trail bosses gathering their crews for the spring cattle drives, men who understood, better than most, that a well-fed crew was a productive crew, that the difference between a cook who merely filled bellies and one who fed both body and morale could mean the difference between a drive that held together through hardship and one that fell apart in bitterness and desertion somewhere on the long trail north. It was Jonas Reed, trail boss for the Circle K outfit, who came first, riding into the Lazy Diamond yard on a hot afternoon in early spring with a particular confident swagger of a man accustomed to getting what he came for. He was younger than most trail bosses, not yet 30, but had earned his position through a combination of genuine skill with cattle and an unusual, quiet thoughtfulness that set him apart from the loud, blustering men who typically held such posts. He found Clara in the bunkhouse kitchen, flour on her hands and a lock of dark hair escaping her headscarf, and stood in the doorway for a long moment before speaking, as though genuinely uncertain how to phrase what he'd come to ask. "Miss Doyle," he said finally, removing his hat with a courtesy that surprised her. "I've heard talk of your cooking clear over at the Circle K, and I'll admit I came here expecting the talk was exaggerated, the way such things usually are. But I passed through your bunkhouse at noon and smelled what you'd made, and I'm here to ask plainly whether you'd consider cooking for my outfit on the drive north this season. I can offer fair wages, better than what you're likely getting here, and a position of genuine respect on the crew, not a punishment detail." Clara had been so unprepared for the question that she'd simply stared at him for a long moment, uncertain whether he was mocking her or entirely sincere. "You'd trust a woman to cook for a whole trail crew, 3 months on the open range?" "I'd trust good cooking wherever I found it," Jonas said simply, "and I've never much cared whether it came from a man or a woman, only whether it kept my crew strong and willing through hard miles. I've lost good hands before to outfits with better cooks than mine, Miss Doyle. I'd rather not lose any more." Before Clara could formulate a response, a second rider entered the yard, and then a third within the week, each one a trail boss who had heard the growing reputation of the Lazy Diamond's remarkable cook and come to make the same offer, each with slightly different terms, slightly different promises. There was Big Tom Halloran of the Rafter B, a barrel-chested man whose gruff exterior concealed a genuine anxiety about his outfit's persistent troubles keeping crews together on the long drives. There was Elias Cobb of the Diamond S, older and more formal, who offered the highest wages of all four but spoke of the position with a businesslike detachment that left Clara feeling more like a hired implement than a valued member of any crew. And finally, somewhat to her surprise, came Foreman Whitcomb himself, of all people, suddenly reversing course entirely and insisting that Clara's punishment had run its course, that she would be permitted to return to her regular duties, an offer transparently motivated not by any genuine change of heart but by his sudden alarm at the prospect of losing, to a rival outfit, the very cook he had installed as an act of humiliation. Clara found herself, within the space of a single remarkable week, transformed from a woman punished and humbled before the entire ranch into the most sought-after cook in the county, for grown men vying for her services with an earnestness that would have seemed impossible only days before. It was a heady, dizzying reversal, and she might have been forgiven for losing herself entirely in the novelty of being wanted rather than merely tolerated, except that amid all the competing offers and flattering promises, it was Jonas Reed's quiet, unassuming manner that lingered most persistently in her thoughts, long after the other trail bosses had ridden off to await her decision. He returned twice more in the following days, not to press his offer further but simply, it seemed, to talk with her while she worked, asking her about the dishes she prepared with a genuine curiosity that had nothing calculated about it, telling her something of his own history in turn, a childhood on a failing Texas farm, an early start as a cattle hand at 14. Years of hard work and careful observation that had earned him his position as trail boss through merit rather than connection or inheritance. He did not flatter her cooking with the exaggerated praise the other trail bosses had offered in their eagerness to secure her services. Instead, he asked thoughtful questions. Why she'd chosen to season the beans as she had, whether a particular herb she'd used grew wild nearby, what she thought might improve a trail crew's morale beyond simply the food itself. Questions that treated her not merely as a skilled cook, but as a person whose judgment and experience were genuinely worth consulting. "You could have any of them," he told her plainly, on the third such visit, as she kneaded a batch of dough at the worn wooden table. "Cobb's offering the highest wage, and Halloran's outfit has an easier route this season, less river crossing to contend with. I won't pretend my offer's the best one on the table, Miss Doyle," in terms of what I can pay you outright. Then why should I choose it? Clara asked, genuinely curious, wiping flour from her hands as she studied him. Jonas considered the question with the same careful thoughtfulness he brought to everything, turning his hat slowly in his hands. Because I'd not have you thinking of yourself only as a cook, useful for what you put on a plate and nothing more, he said finally. The other men, much as I respect Cobb and Halloran both as cattlemen, they're offering to hire your skill. I'm hoping you'd consider joining my crew, if you're willing, not just cooking for it. There's a difference, I think, though it might not show up any different in the wages. It was, Clara understood in that moment, precisely the distinction that had been missing from every other arrangement offered to her in her 26 years. The difference between being useful and being valued, between having one's labor purchased and having one's presence genuinely wanted. She thought of her mother, who had cooked with love and skill her whole life and had rarely, if ever, been thanked for it as anything more than an expected domestic duty. She thought of Whitcomb's punishment, meant to diminish her, and the strange, unlikely path it had carved toward this moment, standing in a bunkhouse kitchen with flour on her hands, being asked not merely to cook but to belong. I accept, she said, and watched something like genuine relief and quiet joy move across Jonas Reed's weathered young face, an expression far more affecting to her than any of the extravagant promises the other trail bosses had offered. The drive north that spring tested Clara in ways she had not fully anticipated. The brutal early mornings, the unpredictable weather, the constant challenge of preparing meals over open fires with whatever provisions could be carried and resupplied along the long trail to the railhead in Kansas. But she found, to her quiet satisfaction, that she was equal to the challenge, adapting her mother's careful techniques to the demands of trail cooking, coaxing flavor and nourishment from limited stores with the same patient skill she'd shown in the Lazy Diamond bunkhouse, and earning, mile by hard mile, the genuine respect and affection of the entire Circle K crew. Rough men who had initially eyed her presence on the drive with skepticism and who came, within the first difficult week, to regard her as an indispensable and deeply valued member of their company. Jonas, throughout the long drive, maintained the same quiet, respectful thoughtfulness that had first drawn her to accept his offer, never presuming upon their growing closeness, never treating her differently than any other valued member of his crew in the eyes of the men, but finding small moments, in the quiet hour after the evening meal when the crew settled around the fire, to sit near her and talk about the stars overhead, about the country they were crossing, about the small griefs and hopes that made up the private architecture of two lives that had, until recently, run along entirely separate paths. It was somewhere past the halfway point of the drive, on a night when a sudden storm had scattered part of the herd and the entire crew had spent exhausting hours in the driving rain rounding up frightened cattle, that Clara found herself genuinely afraid for the first time on the journey, watching Jonas ride hard through the darkness and lightning to head off a group of steers threatening to bolt toward a dangerous ravine. She stood at the edge of the camp long after the herd had been recovered and the storm had passed, watching for his return with a tight, anxious knot in her chest that told her plainly, before her conscious mind had fully caught up to the realization, exactly how much this quiet, thoughtful man had come to matter to her. When he rode back into camp, soaked through and exhausted but unharmed, she crossed the muddy ground to meet him without any of the careful reserve she had maintained throughout the drive, and the relief on her face must have told him everything her words had not yet managed to say, because he dismounted and simply looked at her for a long moment in the darkness, rain still falling lightly around them, before speaking. I was afraid, she admitted, the words coming easier in the exhausted aftermath of the storm than they might have under ordinary circumstances. I don't know when that happened, Jonas, that your safety came to matter to me the way it does. But it has, and I find I can't pretend otherwise any longer. It happened for me somewhere around the second week, Jonas said quietly. Watching you feed 20 tired, difficult men with more patience and skill than I've seen in cooks twice your years, and never once complaining, never once letting the hardship of this trail dim whatever it is in you that makes every man in this crew a little better for having known you. I've been trying to find the right way to tell you as much without overstepping what you'd agreed to when you signed on. They stood together in the wet darkness of the trail camp, the herd settling into uneasy quiet around them, and Clara understood that the punishment meant to humble her, the humiliating banishment to a grease-stained bunkhouse kitchen, had led her instead to this unlikely moment, standing beside a good and thoughtful man on a cattle trail 300 miles from the ranch that had once seen her only as a burden to be managed rather than a woman of genuine worth. The drive reached the railhead 3 weeks later, the herd delivered intact and the Circle K's reputation, along with Clara's own, considerably enhanced by a season that had gone more smoothly than any in recent memory, a fact every man on the crew attributed, without hesitation, to the remarkable cook who had kept them fed and steady through every hardship the trail had offered. When the crew scattered toward home and toward whatever plans the summer held, Jonas asked Clara, with the same careful, genuine courtesy that had first won her regard, whether she might consider making her position with him permanent, not merely as his outfit's cook, but as his wife, a partner in whatever life he might build beyond the seasonal work of the trail. Clara Doyle, who had once stood humiliated before the entire Lazy Diamond Ranch, banished to a punishment kitchen meant to break her spirit, said yes to Jonas Reed beneath the wide Kansas sky with a certainty that came from having discovered, through hardship and unlikely reversal, exactly what she was worth, and exactly what kind of love was worth accepting in return. What Whitcomb had intended as her lowest humiliation had become, through her own quiet skill and unbending dignity, the very door through which her truest happiness had finally walked in. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe for more tales of resilience, unexpected love, and second chances on the American frontier. New stories every week, waiting for you.